You might see a consent to recording pop up, which is a nice new feature. My name is Catherine Green and I'm with IMS Global. Thanks for joining us here today. This is the Adaptive Task Force Proof of Concept presentation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Again, thanks for joining us. We have a great group of folks who are our presenters today. I have one colleague here from IMS with me, and then Bill, Jenna, and Dale will introduce themselves as they go. Before we kick that off, I do want to give a couple just minutes to introduce you to IMS. I know most of you are here because you are an IMS member, but as a reminder, IMS has been around for 20 years and it connects K-12, higher ed, and the workforce. I think each of us get into our little silos and we don't interact much with folks in those other groups, but IMS supports them all. Like many of you who've worked in education, we've seen some great growth over the last few years, and I know we all feel the importance and the gravity of the work that we do, particularly in the last year. We're going to take a quick look at the many, many initiatives that IMS supports, and on these slides, you'll see the names of the many specifications that support those initiatives. Many of these are going to be included in our proof of concept. Some of them might be new to you. It's a great chance to see how they can all interplay together. So we have a strong initiative with learning platforms, apps, and tools, learning data and analytics, adaptive digital curriculum, which doesn't necessarily apply to adaptive learning, but it can work with all of these specifications listed here. Integrated assessment, another one where you'll see that shown in our adaptive proof of concept. And then I want to be sure to point out our IMS certification and product directory. This is the home of all IMS certified products. We'd love to support you and your organization as you pursue certification and/or are looking for certified solutions. Support just like that is included in your membership, and your membership is at your organization level. So it doesn't just apply to you, it applies to you and all of your colleagues. So please do reach out when needed. All right, jumping into our presentation for today, feel free to use the chat for questions. We're going to monitor that as we go. And then if we have time for the end, this is a very quick half an hour, and we want to be sure to share as much information as possible. So my contact information will be there at the end if you have some more questions. This is really an info share. You can connect with me, as mentioned, if you're interested in some invitations, but we really just want to update you on what the group has been doing so far. If you're an attendee and not a presenter, you're welcome to turn off your camera, and most of you have. Again, I appreciate you using the mute button there. Our presenters today, again, Bill Jerome, Senior Product Manager at VitalSource, Jenna Olsen, Senior Analyst Learning Analytics at Western Governors, Dale Johnson, Director of Digital Innovation, University Design Institute at Arizona State, and then Bracken Mosbecker, Technical Architect from IMS Global. A bit of history on task forces at IMS and a little bit about this task force. Task forces at IMS are a time-boxed gathering of suppliers and institutional members working towards a goal. This task force itself began in 2019. It restarted again last year with a renewed focus on building a proof of concept, and we'll hear more about that from Jenna shortly. This team meets once a month, and many of its members also serve on the Adaptive Institutional Leadership Network, so institutions only. They share best practices and knowledge throughout that group. The objective for today's presentation is really, like I said, it's an info share. The team wants to get the work thus far in front of IMS members. Please use the chat for questions. And with that, presenters, if you'll just tell me when to go to the next slide, if I'm not doing promptly enough. And Jenna, if you could take it away, that would be great. Oh, you're on mute. Thank you.
Sorry about that. You were thanking everyone for muting, and I muted. So like Catherine mentioned, the goal of a task force is to get together in a designated period of time and focus on creating and actually coming up with something that we produce by the end of it. So at some point we have to transfer our conversations and our plans away from conceptual to a proof of concept, which is what we're really excited to share with all of you today. In our initial meetings as a task force, we talked about what would be needed in order to create something that was truly adaptive. And we came up with a handful of requirements. The first one is a set of shared or merged definitions, so that when we talk about something being adaptive or anything like that, that we're using a similar enough language that we can agree on what we're working towards. The second requirement on our next goal is to have atomic pieces of content, things that are interchangeable and that are small enough that we can build them together to make a learning delivery as easily as possible. And then the last thing that we talked about needing is tags or metadata about those pieces of content that would include things like the competencies and the standards that they relate to, so that we can make sure that we're meeting whatever curriculum requirements are necessary for that section. Catherine, thank you. So our initial model, as you can see, is extremely complex. When we were putting these slides together, Dale and I both agreed that this is something we'd feel really awkward even having on a slide because it's so busy. So we decided to focus on a subset of it. Catherine, thank you. So we're focusing on the atom and the ion section of this. ATOM is an acronym. It stands for Adaptive Technology Operating Model. And that's the concept or the model that defines a lesson as a learning objective, an assessment activity, and a taxonomic reference, so that we can build those pieces. It's very much in the vein of looking at an atom as the smallest possible piece of something. In this case, that something is a lesson. And then an ion is an instructional object number, which lets us uniquely identify the different parts of that lesson. So here we have, if you look in the ion row, we have instructional resources 1 and 2, and then a formative assessment, and then instructional resources 3 and 4, and a summative assessment. And each of those parts has a unique identifier that we can use. And then they're all grouped together into that larger atom that's usable. So, Dale?
Yeah, the question that everyone asks is, why do we need this standard? And what we've done is we've tried to think about this as an information architecture challenge. So can you roll the next sets? So we need to create really a scalable instructional infrastructure, something that will not be vendor locked and we can use universally, so that we can have more manageable modules for faculty to organize. And then that opens up the opportunity to personalize the learning opportunity for the students. So these pieces of the puzzle all fit together. There's also the challenges that we face. So we struggled to overcome a number of things like content confetti. In the LMS, Caliper was designed to try to organize that mess, but it's hard to do after the fact. So we want to reduce the mayhem that we have currently in our course management processes, and then increase the amount of connectivity. So we want to reduce the isolation among these instructional resources. We're also looking forward to doing some things in the future, like configuring courses more efficiently, allowing the users to analyze the learning outcomes more easily, and then personalizing instruction for the students. So our overall objectives are to facilitate that process for faculty and students. The atom, as was described here, is really 3 components. We call it the ed molecule when you put them all together. And that forms a lesson, to use common language. That lesson is building on a history now of work that IMS has done. So we've got the case standard, we've got thin common cartridge, we already have the QTI standard, and we have Caliper. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do we put all of these things together so that adaptive systems can share information and that the users can get the most value from those systems? So that gives you some context for why we're doing this. And now I'll hand it off for a description of kind of the next pieces here.
Yeah, and so I'll just talk for a second because Bracken has the fun stuff to show us. But just to sort of drive home this point about vocabulary, right? We want to make sure that when you're looking to use, you know, a system or this specification, like that everyone is talking the same term. And you know, that common vocabulary between business and products instruction is important. And as if to drive that point home today, I had 2 separate meetings this morning. I made a list because it struck me for today. In a data model, we were talking about questions, question lists, assessment enrichments, question context, and question parts. And there was much confusion, and that was on 2 meetings I had this morning at the same company working on the same product. So, you know, just within your own organization, I'm sure you feel that you've had those meetings too, like I have. And so we've thought it was important right out of the gate to work on this shared vocabulary, so that then when we look at like what Bracken has to show you, you know, we're all speaking the same language.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Bracken. So with all that in mind, we, you know, this is the first stage of IMS having an adaptive group trying to cover some of these problems. And, you know, we wanted to start working the vocabulary, and we've got a nice spreadsheet where we're kind of working all that, and it's great. But to make something a little bit more practical, we decided to use Common Cartridge and try to answer questions like, you know, given these concepts, given these models we're talking about, can Common Cartridge define those, how it sits now, you know, can it actually move these learning objects between systems with these definitions? What's it mean for the, you know, adaptive content to be interoperable, and can Common Cartridge move it? That's probably a better way to say it. And then, you know, we wanted to start a tool that, you know, a course designer, instructional designer could look, you know, could evaluate the Common Cartridge and say, hey, will this work for the needs I have in my course? So Catherine, if you stop sharing, I'll start. Let's see, there we go. All right, so what we took some work from an IMS member who has a nice JavaScript Common Cartridge previewer already, and we started adapting that with this project in mind. And so I've got a couple examples to show you, and I'll just kind of talk through this really quick, and we'll be happy to answer questions when we have time. So what this is just, you know, it's a JavaScript implementation in the browser, but if you upload a Common Cartridge, there's a couple of preset ones here that we're going to go through. And so this is, we're looking at a Common Cartridge that is meant to represent the Oregon Common Core algebra and then a specific outcome within that. We'll get into the details of all these. But if you're familiar with Case Network, what this is inside Case Network is Oregon has their state standards in Case Network, and we're looking at a cartridge that would represent teaching this outcome, seeing structure and expressions. And so, you know, you're going to see lots of these GUIDs and stuff in here, and these titles from each of these learning outcomes. You don't need to remember those, but just know that they're essentially, we have a bunch of learning outcomes aligned to each of these case items in here. And so in here, there's kind of 2 areas. There's cartridge level metadata. So you have a Common Cartridge, and there's a bunch of information about the whole package. And then there's information about each individual resource and lesson in there. And so what we're, you know, showing here is some of the metadata at the cartridge level. You know, things like what version of Common Cartridge, you know, what the copyright statements are, a typical age range. This is, you know, grades 10 through 12 or something like that. And then the learning objectives covered at the cartridge level. There's a lot more information we will put here and would like to emphasize for an adaptive use case. For now, we just have those as an example. So again, we show the cartridge level, and that can kind of help you, give you some context of what you're looking at. And then within here, this has a bunch of lessons. And for each lesson, or in this case, this cartridge is kind of designed as a bucket of learning resources aligned to learning objectives. And so for each of these, this one is A1B. So if you remember back here, that covers this specific outcome. There's an instructional resource, an instructional practice activity, and an assessment activity. And if you remember back to that atom ion stuff we're talking about, the vocabulary, those are the three pieces are instructional resource, assessment activity, and aligned to an outcome. And so, you know, this represents an ed molecule, that's hard to say for me, that, you know, has all the information in here. And so for each learning objective for this area, there is an ed molecule's worth of content in here. And so someone trying to evaluate this cartridge getting here like, oh, I really need to find, understand what materials are in here for each of my outcomes. This really makes it a lot easier. But this cartridge is kind of built with this use in mind, like all of these are specifically aligned, and those 3 resources are together. In another example, so I have one that's reading standards, which maybe won't be used in adaptive systems as frequently as math ones, but this cartridge is kind of a more traditional cartridge where it's got a bunch of lessons that have a flow, like they have, some reading materials, a discussion, and then a quiz. And so this is a cartridge that's very useful and it's ready to import and be used by a teacher. But it can also be used in adaptive system because these are also aligned to learning objectives. And we wanted to make a nice view in here where instead of sorting by the lesson plan, you can actually just sort it by the learning objectives. And so for each objective in this cartridge, it looks pretty similar to the lesson plan one because they're all aligned. But the point is that, you can, just have a view of your objectives, like, oh, I want to know about, this one and what are the resources aligned with this. And so even if a cartridge wasn't meant specifically for adaptive systems, but it's a well-aligned to learning outcomes cartridge, this will still help you understand what's in there and hopefully help you understand whether this could work in your adaptive system that you have, or even just in your LMS. And so a couple of things in here. A lot of these LTI would be very common to put your content in systems like this. So we can't actually preview LTI content because that's generally behind, a credentialed system. But you can show a lot of information on who the vendor is if they have their vendor information in there. You can preview certain discussion topics, for example, and then if this is using Common Cartridge 1.4, which now has line items in it, so you can get a preview of the line item information, so the grades associated with these LTI assignments. So even if it's a quiz that's not in QTI, it's just an LTI, so you can't actually see it, you can still get a little bit of the meta information about it and understand how that would work in the context of your course and your adaptive system. So that's kind of, that's the scope of our current proof of concept. We're just trying to show like, hey, Common Cartridge can convey this information, and this is what an adaptive cartridge could look like. And we're able to actually evaluate those cartridges to some degree. Is this something, we're hoping to move forward and find people who would want to adopt something like this. So some of our items about what's next, there's a lot of potential here. We're kind of at the beginning of this adaptive process. So one of potential along the lines we've been talking about is, having this explicit IMS data model around adaptive content and adaptive systems. Maybe we publish that or make it part of our common data model. Here's how we model adaptive systems and make that official. Maybe the work this group is doing will go towards that. Common Cartridge in the latest edition has a new K-12 profile. What that is making sure that cartridges align content to standards and kind of fulfill some of the needs of the K-12 systems. We could define a new Common Cartridge profile for adaptive cartridges. Say, hey, this, every resource is aligned. Each of them have a resource, an outcome, and a quiz, for example, stuff like that. That could be a great output of this group, or something that could really help build an ecosystem. And then long term, looking forward to more we talked about and somewhat what Dale was talking about. This is just defining a basis so that we can actually have interoperable adaptive systems, which we don't have now, but we would like to be able to, have the analytics about those. If an institution uses 3 different adaptive systems, right now they'd have to go to dashboards and get context from each of them separately. If we have a combined vocabulary, combined understanding of, some basis for adaptivity, that really helps the analytics situation where each of these different systems can still emit, maybe an adaptive caliper profile events that explain the concepts consistently between the systems, even if they do have their own unique attributes and ways of doing things. We believe there's probably enough commonality there to have great analytics across multiple systems. So I think that's that part. Catherine, I'm going to stop sharing so you can take it back over.
Great.
We're also happy to answer questions when we get to that.
Yeah, we got a question from Eric Stano, and I thought this is a good one. I don't know if everybody's ready yet, but I can read it out loud. Has there been thought to prerequisites relative to content, given that this is intended for an adaptive context? And what we did was we started small. So we're thinking about the data architecture first, and then you're describing the interconnected relationships between these ed molecules. And that's something that we still have to work on. You know, how do you track the relationship between these various components? So with the current data architecture, we would start with the ed molecule, and then we would look for that metadata linking the sequence of ed molecules and the network of ed molecules. So I always think about it as a three-dimensional object that lives in whatever system is hosting that instructional material.
Right, and we're kind of seeing CASE and infrastructure created by CASE of being able to align individual resources, analytics events, and whole lessons and modules to specific outcomes as kind of the connective tissue on all of these. So there's a lot of existing content out there, and maybe it's aligned to, you know, one state or to Common Core itself, you know, but there's ways to map those between those. You know, CASE is working on pathways to for some of these things. So we kind of see CASE as a central piece of tying together existing lessons and, you know, the future potential analytics and other common cartridge profiles.
Joshua, I saw you have a raised hand.
Yeah, well, Bracken covered what I was about to say perfectly, but I'll extend it slightly. So currently in CASE, there is a precedes relationship. I wanted to ask in that cartridge whether those URIs for the skills were CASE identifiers or not. But if they were, then there might be a precedes relationship in the framework in which that item exists, in which case that can be interpreted as, you know, this skill precedes that skill, or the inverse of precedes is also logically that this follows that. That's currently supported in CASE, so there's that amount of pathway. But yes, we are considering whether that fits in the scope of the next release of CASE. And I think if someone's interested in adaptive systems, participating in that conversation in the CASE task force is a requirement. How these atoms are aligned to CASE items and frameworks, and how frameworks are aligned to each other or correlated, and how they relate to pathways, I think is a necessary precondition to enable this kind of adaptive learning.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and in that example, I mean, those are all aligned. They all have CASE URIs, and they're hot linkable to CASE network if they're in there. So I didn't show that very closely, but as you know, those pathways and sequences in there, for a tool like this, that would be good. That would be excellent next steps. You know, showing the learning outcomes in sequence to how they're configured and things like that. So there's a lot of potential great additions there, I think.
Yeah, there's another question from Douglas Stein. Similar. Do you want to read it, Catherine? Do you want me to?
Please feel free, Dale. Thank you.
Okay, each atom looks like a testlet, as in testlet-adaptive assessment with embedded content. Is that a fair interpretation? Yes. I think what we're trying to figure out is the metadata that's going to add more value to these independent objects. So if you have assessment questions and you have instructional resources and they're floating in your LMS and they're not linked, they don't have as much value. So that's the metadata that Bracken was referring to throughout his presentation. And then the second part of the question is, can we incorporate the machinery the assessment space uses to blueprint and transition from atom to atom? And I think that was just part of the CASE conversation. What I'd love to be able to do in the future as an instructional designer is to liberate that lesson from some formal structure so that you can move it around. And as you reassemble those lessons into a course or into a module, that's going to take on that new structure, and then you can take the metadata from that. So identifying the relationships and building those transitional maps is going to be a really high value outcome from this effort.
Yeah, and a lot of what this group has been doing so far and will do is this incorporates many IMS specifications, as we showed on some of those slides, and it kind of brings a lot of the pieces together. And so, it might be that the output of this work is just, hey, we use these 3 specs in this way and this one in this way, and it's not, any new thing in any specific specification. It's just a definition of how to use a bunch of these together to solve an adaptive use case. And so it will involve lots of connective tissue again between specs and existing systems who do a lot of this stuff already, just in their own specific way. And we want to try to be able to unify the way the different systems think about it for institutions, so they can work together with all their vendors.
I would also add, we're not trying to design an adaptive instructional system. What we're trying to do is we're trying to design an information architecture that can be useful across any system. And what I've encountered is, over the last 8 years, I've worked with a half dozen different adaptive systems. And this effort is really a synthesis effort to try to come up with a model that if a new vendor wants to join in to the adaptive effort and wants to start adding that capability to their existing functionality, then this is how they would do it. And that way, if you're trying to move content from one vendor to another, or you have to support a half dozen vendors, it makes sense to you as a learning analyst, as a faculty member, as an instructional designer.
Eric, so I'll read this, and this might be our last question, but on the point of making it useful to adaptive systems, whether it be data relative to things like rigor, harder reading passages versus simpler ones to inform the harvesting of context for an adaptive system, answer is yes. Common Cartridge already has some metadata fields relevant to a few different things like that. Difficulty and other information. I can't think of them offhand. So Common Cartridge can already define that and move that between systems. What this work would be is, helping that metadata is not broadly used. A lot of LMSs don't even import case GUIDs right now. And so with a lot of this meta work, across these specifications is defining a thing, a set, and then getting people to actually implement and use what's already there, and finding out what new pieces are needed. So definitely there's already places for those kinds of things. And we just want to try to make those obvious and get people to start adopting and using them.
Yeah, part of the specification isn't the right word. Part of the structure of the atom in this discussion is the idea of a taxonomic level from like Bloom's taxonomy, which would help capture that idea of how difficult is this section. So like Bracken was saying, the superstructure around it exists. It's more a matter of getting people to use it.
These are great questions. Thanks everybody for your attention today and your thoughtfulness around this. My email address is there on the slide if you have any more questions or desire to get involved. And thank you to our presenters today for all their good work and for making this a great half an hour. Thanks everybody for attending. Take care. Thank you.